Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Bienvenue. If you were at our opening ceremony, then welcome back. And if you missed our opening ceremony, where were you? You missed. Amazing, amazing work from Nancy Houston and Chloe Baker. And we had Rory Stewart in a taxi, which has never been done before. That man can podcast anyway. Extraordinary start to the evening to start our ideas fizzing around from the personal to the political. We shall inspire you further in our next session here. You can see it's the return of geopolitical blocs, ? There will be a question and answer session at the end of the panel we're about to hear, so do stick around for that, and do store up your questions for that, because that's the question mark, and hopefully we can provide the answers. We've got an extraordinary panel for you, an extraordinary panel of minds from around this subject who will probe it far better than I ever could. So I'm going to bring them up. The panel will be chaired by Ramona Bloj, who's come to us from Paris, the panelists Sébastien Maillard, Djenabou Cissé, and Susan Coughtrie from Scotland. So would you please welcome them to the stage here at the French Institute. Ramona, Sébastien, Djenabou, Susan. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you very much for being here for this roundtable for a very timely and very complex topic, the return of geopolitical blocs. We have an amazing panel to try to answer this question. And first, I would like to give you the framework of the discussion. So we will look at how growing tensions are challenging the multilateral order and how diplomatic, scientific, industrial, and military rivalries escalate all over the world. So we will try to see how, beyond the competition between states and their institutions, conflicting ideologies and new narratives are currently at stake. And we will give us further challenges and try to answer the question, how can international cooperation face these geopolitical fault lines and play a key role in ensuring a stable future? So we have the honor to host a great panel. So right here is Sébastien Maillard, who is an associate fellow at Chatham House and special advisor at the Institut Jacques Delors, having previously been its director in Paris. And prior to this, he worked the French newspaper La Croix, and he was its correspondent in Brussels and Rome. And in addition, he was a professor in EU affairs at Sciences Po in Paris and Boston College. We have also Djenabou Cissé, who is a defense and security expert with a focus on military and operational issues. She works on strategic and security questions in Africa, and previously she worked for the French Ministry for Armed Forces, where she held various positions. She also teaches at Sciences Po in Paris. And last but not least, we have with us Susan Coughtrie, who has been the director for Foreign Policy Center since last year, and previously to that, he joined this international affairs think tank in 2020 as project director for the Unsafe for Scrutiny project, which explores the risks and threats facing journalists uncovering financial crime and corruption. The findings of this research led Susan to co-found the UK Anti-SLAPP Coalition in January 2021, which she continues to co-chair today. So without further ado, we have we have a very short time frame to treat these questions. So we will have 5 minutes of introductory remark for each one of our panelists. We will have short roundtables and afterwards questions from the public. So without further ado, Sébastien Maillard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ramona, and thank you all for being here tonight for this panel, because I think the attendance shows how serious our questions are tonight. We're actually speaking just days ahead of the second anniversary of the second Russian invasion of Ukraine, the first one being in 2014 on Crimea. I think it's perhaps the most striking, the harshest, and perhaps even old-fashioned way of what we call the region of empires, of new power struggles. which also often take more sophisticated hybrid forms than just military. We saw it, for instance, through the damaging of critical infrastructures, or overtaking strategic assets, or weaponizing migration or disinformation. But a country overtaking its neighbor on this very continent, of course, sends perhaps the most alarming signal of what sometimes we wonder if these are new fault lines being drawn. Even the very notion of Ruski Mir, Russian world, is quite dangerous because no one could really tell where are its exact boundaries. It's very unclear. I mean, if I were going to ask someone here to come up and draw us the Russian world, I don't know if he could do it or she could do it. We also see the Turkish diplomacy using the expression of Turkish world, which also is difficult sometimes to define precisely. We saw the BRICS expanding. There's this notion of global south. I've never really understood what it really means. So I don't know if there's a return of geopolitical blocks, because bloc is perhaps not the best metaphor. It sounds very Cold War. I know we often talk about the new Cold War, but I would rather talk of a return of geopolitical movements. We witness bewildering cross-currents sweeping the world. Look at the Western Balkans, for instance. You see Russian, Chinese, Turkish, US, the Emirates influences rival, and of course the EU. And I'd like to focus a bit on the EU because I think it's a totally new environment for the European Union. It was not meant to grasp this in the first place. I mean, the EU is firstly, I would say, an internal project. It's a peace project to set up a lasting peace among ourselves within the EU through the respect of the law, through our interdependence or our joint interests. And if you look at the hallmarks of European integration, like the internal market or Euro or the Schengen, they were all been always thought at the scale and for the sake of the EU. And I would say the EU's relationship to the world was and actually is still through free trade agreements or development aid, always relying on a rules-based multilateral order. And I think the EU prides itself, or tried to believe that it can be inspiring for the rest of the world, but never defining a geopolitical vision of what it wants to be. And I was happily surprised when President of the Commission, von der Leyen, got elected in 2019, and she said she wanted a geopolitical commission, remember? It's a vision, we're not there yet, but what does actually, how did this materialize? Well, mainly by injecting security concerns into its economic decisions, be it through homegrown technology and industry. I mean, if you look at the new EU initiative today, it's about taking a common approach on export controls, on screening foreign investments, on it's a carbon border adjustment tax. Even I was thinking this week, when the Net Zero Industry Act was voted the European Parliament in reaction to the IRA, it's meant to enhance EU-based green power plants. So all this is meant, these new instruments are meant to transform the EU, I would say, from an internal peace project to a power project toward the world, and to try to affirm the EU in a multipolar world. And I insist on this multipolarism because multipolar world means less rational, less predictable. I like this way that Josep Borrell, the European High Representative for Foreign Affairs, he says it's a world that is more and more getting multipolar and less multilateral. And I think that's troubling for the EU because we're comfortable in a multilateral world, but not so much in a multipolar world, and I think the aim today is trying to make the EU a full-fledged power in its own right. And enlargement, in a way, is viewed in that perspective. So it means a power that is not just soft, but also maybe tougher, yet always respectful of international law. And I think, and I will end there, it's ever more necessary while another fault line may appear over the Atlantic. The Russian war, we saw, has put back NATO. It was not dead, but I mean, it was really now it's growing. I mean, we see Finland has joined, Sweden is about to join. And this could be that the EU gets sort of swallowed in the Western Bloc, in a vision where you have the West versus the rest, or a sort of global West. But as we see a Trump-shaped shadow looming over Europe, even stretching perhaps, the EU, and this is also, I think, true also for the UK, is aiming to build its own military capabilities, and also, I mean, I read this morning that the European Investment Bank is now considering investing in weapons and ammunition. So, well, it's part of it's a question. But the fact this question is raised, see how the kind of shift the EU will go through. So, to secure and diversify our supply chains of raw material, do EU-based industrial production, all this is meant to try for the EU to become a power in its own right. And, well, to end and put it in a nutshell, if we have on one side Ruski Mir, Russian world, and on the other side perhaps the America first, or perhaps a weaker America prevailing, well then I think the EU and Europe as a whole must start considering itself a power with its own values and interests. And I'm not sure that means more EU, but certainly a different EU. And the question actually I have is, are we ready for this? Do we Europeans want this? Does Germany want this? And it's an answer we have to give, because I think the task of supporting Ukraine is passing to us quickly.
Thank you very much for this very complete overview of the situation in Europe. Djenabou, Cissé, if we look in Africa, how do you see these new geopolitical blocks in terms of power competition on the continent?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I actually agree with Sébastien when he's saying that the return of geopolitical blocks is not really a good phrase. Talking about Africa, I would rather talk of a return of a strategic competition, and especially in regards with the multipolarity of the world. We've seen, when we talk about the return of, well, blocks or strategic competition, it's hard not to talk about Africa, since a lot of observers have been talking about a new scramble for Africa in recent years. We've seen indeed a growing interest from new powers regarding Africa, and especially regarding regions like West Africa. The term new powers arriving in Africa is not really pertinent either, because when we talk about Russia, there's been actually a history of relations with the continent, especially going back to the Cold War. So there's been agreements dating back to this era. But we've seen new countries like Turkey with its diplomacy of drones, for example. The country has been selling armored vehicles, but also cheaper, but of good quality drones. There's also India, which we barely talk about India, but they actually have a great development policy on the continent. Obviously, China, we've talked a lot about it regarding the loan policy. And the Gulf countries with their strong competition in the Horn of Africa in particular. I would say that these growing interests in recent years can be attributed to several factors. First of all, obviously there's an interest for the resources, whether they're natural or human, because besides natural resources, Africa is going through a huge demographic explosion. By the end of the century, 4 out of 10 people in the world are going to be Africans, and a huge portion of these people are going to be under 25. So there's potential for a new workforce for the world, because the active population is going to grow significantly. And there's also the other factor for me that can explain the new links between some African countries and some other powers is actually the will from African countries to diversify their partnerships with other powers. And it's been the case especially for Western African countries, where the main partners used to be the EU, and when we talk about security partnership, France used to be the main security provider for the region, but now obviously some countries have turned towards other powers like Russia, but this is not just because of the growth of an anti-French sentiment and just because of Russian action in the region. They are very important factors, but people tend to underestimate the fact that African countries, and especially Western African countries, have been diversifying their alliances, at least since the 1990s. And there's been a will on the continent for several decades now to not put all the eggs in the same basket, and to not depend and rely on just one ally. And this is also due to the globalization of the world. So I feel like it's important not to underestimate that, because people tend to push the narratives that African countries are, being manipulated by these new powers and that they don't know any better. But it's actually not that simple. There's a lot of opportunity. I mean, for me, the relations are very opportunistic on both sides, whether it's on the Russian side or the African side. Again, talking about West Africa, because it's been the main strategic region for France for a long time on the continent. It's been what's been striking is obviously the arrival of Wagner, who initially was based in Central African Republic and Libya and Sudan, and they have actually profited over the failure of the Barkhane operations to actually increase their influence in the region. And the juntas, the military juntas that took over, actually understood that capitalizing on anti-French sentiment, capitalizing on Russia influence on the continent is actually great political gains for them. So that's why the junta in Niger pushed the narrative. The first day of the coup, France wasn't in the picture. It wasn't part of the narrative. But they took they took some lessons from the previous coup in Mali, in Burkina Faso. They saw that actually talking against France was a great way to gain, to have political gains within some parts of the populations, and that's why they changed their narrative the second and third days after the coup, and focusing on France. I think, again, Russia, when we talk about Russian influence on the continent, we have to be nuanced in our analysis. There's a huge risk because the whole Russian strategy is just going into a country in crisis, instrumentalizing the crisis to then conclude some weapon deals and push an informational warfare to extend their influence. But there's no real global strategy for the continent. There even isn't huge economic investment from Russia on the continent. India, again, invests much more on the continent than Russia. Russia remains an economic dwarf on the continent. So their strategy is really cost efficient because just the informational warfare, it doesn't cost much for them. They use a huge galaxy of actors, whether it's Sputnik, Russian Today, local relays like Pan-Africanist militants that relay the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist narrative. So it's a huge galaxy of actors, whether they're transparent or more clandestine, but it's really cost efficient. It doesn't cost anything for Russia, but it's very efficient for them to extend their influence. So for me, it's kind of the stakes are there, especially considering that in Europe, counter-influence, counter cyber, building a communication narrative, that's something that we've not really been good at. And that's actually the strength of Russia and China and Turkey. They have a political narrative that they manage to instrumentalize and to push in different areas. I will just conclude with, for me, the future of the strategic competition between powers will be in Africa, especially considering that with the energy transition, with the demographic issues, a lot of stakes are concentrated on the continent, talking about critical minerals that are so fundamental for our telephone batteries and our some weapons and armaments. All of that depend on critical minerals, and those critical minerals are actually 30% of the global reserves are in Africa. So that also explains a part of the competition happening today. China controls 40% of these supply chains. And the Horn of Africa is actually one of the regions very critical for these stakes. Same thing when we talk about demography. Again, 4 out of 10 people by the end of the century are going to be Africans. So the futures of Europe and Africa are linked. That's something that we hear a lot, but there's not been so much reforms or policies put into place so far to adapt to the huge changes happening on the continent. And some powers like China and Russia and even Turkey have understood that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Susan Coughtrie, I have a very precise question. In is the notion of geopolitical blocks or strategic competition relevant when we look at different actors of informal networks of corruption, for example?
Thank you. Yes, I think your question points to the fact that we are often thinking about international relations when it comes to states and state dynamics, and obviously we also talk about regional forums and international relations. I'm very interested in the work that I do at the Foreign Policy Centre on different types of networks, both those who are kind of corrupt and those who are trying to fight it. So the Unsafe for Scrutiny project that I started a few years ago looks at risks and threats to journalists who uncover financial crime and corruption. And I think this is a topic that has been well known about in certain circles for a long time, but has only really started to become part of the conversation in the last 3 or 4 years, and I think particularly in this country, promoted as a result of, as you rightly say, the second invasion into Ukraine. And so, it's this kind of nexus, basically, of transnational corruption and media freedom, and transnational corruption as a driving force for disorder. I think when we think about what motivates countries, and more crucially their political elites, why are they making certain decisions? All countries have a certain level of self-interest, but I think in countries like Russia, we can see the political elite and the level of corruption that they have enriched themselves is a motivating factor for their international decisions as well. And therefore, my point really in terms of trying to address the question of international cooperation is how can we fix some of these underlying issues? And I think countering kleptocracy and corruption is absolutely critical. I'm mostly focused on the UK, and this issue has been raised before the invasion. There was a report released by the the Intelligence and the Security Committee in the UK Parliament in 2020, which warned very highly of the role that London played in laundering money, known as the London laundromat. But I think it's still quite staggering when you realise, the Russian laundromat, which was one of the kind of investigations uncovered by international journalists, saw upwards of 20 billion funneled out of Russia over a 4-year period through a network of global banks and shell companies, but over 50% of the money came through shell companies registered in the UK. The money was then eventually laundered in at least 96 countries. This money is having an impact, this corrupt kleptocracy is having an impact inside countries. I worked for a number of years in Russia and saw the closing civic space, the crackdown on journalists who work there. Which is so vital. Media and their role in enhancing democracy and empowering societies to hold their politicians to account and also to make informed decisions about what's going on around them. Clearly, if you're corrupt, you don't want people to know about it. So it's a strongly motivating factor to shut down civic space. And we've seen this, and I must say, not just in Russia, similar stories. Also, we've seen Azerbaijan, 2.9 billion funneled out of Azerbaijan over 2 years through 4 UK shell companies. Moldova, 1 billion was disappeared 10 years ago. 12% of the country's GDP left its borders and went elsewhere. And we aren't good enough as countries yet in understanding where all that money's gone, but also where that money is ending up in influence. And I think what happened, 2 years ago after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was a sudden reaction, at least in this country, and I think elsewhere, certainly in the US and Europe, that we've been kind of sleeping at the tiller, and we really needed to take action to address that. And some of the research that we did at an early stage, and this was even before the invasion, was looking at all kinds of risks and threats to journalists who uncover financial crime and corruption, because often they are the ones that face the consequences of exposing this, rather than actually the people who are doing it. It was that early research that pointed us to, I think commonly when you think about attacks on journalists, you often think of physical attacks or assassinations and what have you. But we had responses from 63 journalists working on this topic in 41 countries who really clearly pointed to legal threats being an issue, and that it was stopping them from being able to continue to do their work. This kind of threat now is referred to as a SLAP, which is a slightly awkward acronym that stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation, but it basically means a legal threat or a legal action which tries to shut down public scrutiny or information in the public interest being published. And that creates a huge chilling effect. It's why a lot of the information about kleptocracy from Russia, as I said, and from other countries, isn't as well known about as it should be. I'm pleased to say that there has been a lot of work in this area in the last couple of years, and that's an example of international cooperation in the EU. They now have a EU anti-SLAP directive. Here in the UK, the coalition that I'm part of has been pushing for a standalone law. At the moment, we just have some provisions that have been enacted last year in the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. And there are quite a few cases here in the UK that you may have heard of. Catherine Belton, who's a journalist and author who wrote the book Putin's People, was sued by 4 oligarchs here in the UK and the Russian state oil company, Rosneft, the year before the full-scale invasion. And it took her publishers, HarperCollins, $1.5 million to defend the case. And they settled before it got to trial. But even in that short period, you can see the amount of resources that had to be taken to see that off. Another kind of more recent well-known case is that of Elliot Higgins, who ironically was sued by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who everybody knows now is the head of the Wagner Group, but Prigozhin decided to sue Elliot Higgins, who is the founder of Bellingcat, open source investigative website, for a series of tweets that he did linking to articles, including Bellingcat, but CNN and others, exposing him, Prigozhin, as being the leader. And yet he was still able, Prigozhin, despite being under sanctions, to bring a case in the UK, which ultimately collapsed after his legal representation withdrew, and in light of the invasion in Ukraine. And it still left Elliot Higgins £70,000 out of pocket. So these are kind of two, I'd say, hidden challenges. The corruption and the spread of corruption and our lack of defences against it. I mean, how it ends up being exposed by journalists who often pay the price, and the need to defend media freedom, because that's what we see now increasingly in our own democracies, is an attempt to shut down free speech and certainly populist ideals, which then motivate, as we've seen with Trump, fake news and a discrediting of the information ecosystem, the spread of disinformation. So while we're talking about geopolitical blocks, I think we have to find our allies in these areas and see how we can, not only espouse these values, but actually really stand up for them and defend ourselves.
Thank you very much. So if you agree, we can now turn a little bit towards solutions. So we spoke about a lot of challenges. If we look in the European context at the European Union, after 2019, when the European Commission President spoke about the Geopolitical Commission, we had COVID, we had the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of initiatives that you mentioned. Is the enlargement policy and this new European political community a sort of response at this logic of geopolitical blocks?
Enlargement is a problem and a part of the solution, yes. It's fascinating to see that the week after Ukraine got its second invasion, it immediately applied for membership to the EU. Same for Moldavia and Georgia, which was not the most obvious thing to do when you get invaded by Russia. But I think it shows that the EU stands for a way to protect that perhaps if those countries had been already member states would Russia have invaded them. The same goes for NATO, of course. And I think the challenge we face with enlargement is that before, because this year we are going to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the previous enlargement, when we moved from 15 to 25 and 27 member states, the so-called Big Bang. But at the time, I think the EU saw the enlargement more as expanding the same thing. Here, it's enlarging while transforming itself. And there is a geopolitical imperative to do it. So that goes to do it quickly, as fast as we can, because we have to show Putin that there is no gray zone, there is no buffer state. It's this is, in a way, this is our bloc. But the logic, so that's actually the sort of fast track application. But the other logic is that we're mentioning corruption. Even if we want to go as fast as we can to admit those countries and strengthen the EU in the long run, we, of course, may not dilute it, what the EU is about, and I mentioned it's a rules-based, at least I believe it is. And we know there are high level of corruption in Ukraine and elsewhere in the Balkans. And so you cannot have states coming in the EU where the economy is based on oligarchs, where you have the kind of kleptocracy you were describing. So this goes, of course, you would expect delays. So one of the solutions, actually there are two solutions. One is to go perhaps for a stage accession, to have an accession that is not done, it's not a question of just speed, but also of entering progressively. And I think it's an idea that we will see more and more, especially with a country as huge as Ukraine, where you cannot just seriously have it overnight, but in the long run, you cannot wait for decades. And you mentioned the European political community. It's true that it was imagined by President Macron right after the Russian invasion in a way to sort of anticipate both the enlargement in the sense that we already form a community of interests bound by our geographical ties, but we already sort of show that those countries are part of the European family, but also trying, and I was referring to a multipolar world, trying to get Europe as a whole. That's why the UK is part of it, Turkey is part of it, the whole continent to affirm itself, regardless of what happens to the US or regardless to what happens to other parts of the world, so that Europe, beyond the EU, really stands for itself. And I believe the EPC, which is very informal, we don't even know if there's a summit going to happen in the UK, but what I mean is that it's a place for leaders to start talking seriously about the architecture of security for the future.
Thank you. Djenabou, Cissé, you described in a very clear manner this strategic competition on the continent, and you finish your intervention with something very interesting, that the future of Europe and Africa are linked. How do you think that the European Union and the European continent can develop a partnership of equals with African countries in this context of strategic competition?
I think part of the problem in the relationship between African countries and Europe is the whole conditionality principle. One big reason why a lot of African countries prefer dealing or cooperating with other powers is because they feel that these powers do not impose policies regarding human rights or democracy or any other internal political affairs, and they feel that European countries actually have been conditioning their cooperation deals to the implementation of reforms, which is really noble on paper, but considering that in an area where there's a history of colonialism and of imperialism, it is not received well anymore. So when African countries are talking about we want to cooperate equal to equal, they're actually also referring to that, to the fact that they feel like Europe has been dictating their choices, and especially their internal affairs choices. And coming from former colonial powers, it does not sit well with them anymore. So I feel like it's a very sensitive issue, but it has to be addressed. European countries have to be aware of that. The conditionality principle today is an obstacle to some relationships with African countries, and talking about France in Western Africa, a lot of the blame that is put on France isn't always rational or even fair, but the history of the relations influences a lot what's happening today, and the double standard as well. When European countries condemn coup in certain countries, but do not condemn the coup in Chad because they feel like Chad is more stable, even though Chad has had a huge history of coup as well, and has been pretty much in a dictatorship from the Déby dynasty. All of that is seen by African countries, and they believe that it's a double standard. So I feel like, first of all, Europe has to address the whole conditionality principle. Maybe we can find ways to promote our values, because it's the core of Europe is human rights and democracy. It's the core of our values, and Europe shouldn't stop talking about that. But maybe we can find ways to promote these values without imposing them on the partners. Also, I feel like we have to tackle the whole double standard tendencies, and maybe we have to put more pragmatism to our ways of cooperating with African countries. France wasn't really happy with the US when they decided to stay in Niger and to meet with the junta. But at the same time, it was a way for the US to be pragmatic, to safeguard their interests in the country, and to maintain a channel of dialogue and cooperation. So yeah, I feel like we have to be more pragmatic in the way we cooperate with partners, because our competitors, if we have to call them that way, Russia, China, Turkey, they're very pragmatic. They adapt to each country. So we've been too imprisoned by the whole values narrative, but now it's not accepted, and it's not received in the same manner today.
Thank you. And very briefly, Susan Coughtrie, if we can return to these hidden challenges that you mentioned, and what can we do better? Do you think that the fight against what you mentioned, the corruption networks, kleptocracy, is a way of imagining partnership in this age of competition and geopolitical blocks?
Well, I would just say, first of all, that I really agree with what's just been said. I think it's very difficult with a straight face to, impose values on others if you're not living up to them yourselves. And I think, I've spoken to many journalists, for example, living in countries where, their political elites are sending their money back to the UK and laundering their money that way. And the challenges that they already face domestically to then have, that issue unaddressed by the UK, but comes along and promotes these values of democracy, good governance, and media freedom, amongst others. So I think really key is that if we really genuinely believe in these values and we want to have a rules-based order, then we have to act accordingly and hold ourselves accountable as much as we hold others accountable. And I do think the double standards and the feeling of hypocrisy, particularly in other states that we might consider kind of middle powers, I think that really has an effect on how they decide and the course they turn to. Because if they see, well, what do we get from this, other than a lecture? And I think the UK and other countries, the EU, we have a lot to offer, but we need to be consistent and we need the actions to match up with the words. So I think that's probably the kind of nub of it, really.
Thank you. I believe we are running out of time, but perhaps we still have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yes.
Hi, thank you for that discussion. My question is about the perspective from the Global South, and whether the members of the panel think that, let's not talk geopolitical blocks, a multipolar world, whether it will be on balance positive or negative for the Global South, relative to the Cold War, where you were mostly coerced to either be towards the US or the Soviet Union, or in the unipolar world, where there was maybe a little bit of lecturing to adopt Western values. In this new phase, do you think it's going to be mostly positive or negative for Global South countries?
And we have a second one here.
I wanted to ask a question about non-state actors, because they're playing a larger and larger role, say, in the Middle East, and that hasn't been mentioned. So if you could briefly address that. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to address the first question?
I'm afraid I'm not sure I understood the question. So can you repeat it, maybe, the question on the Global South?
Sure. Whether you think a multipolar world is going to be positive or mostly negative for countries in the Global South?
A little bit of both, which is not a very satisfactory answer. For me, well, the positive effects are that now, with the emergence of new poles, we don't have anymore this huge domination from 1 or 2 powers. So it's gonna give more voices to other countries. Something I didn't talk about. One of the reasons some countries are getting more and more interested with Africa is because their voices at the UN, for example, matter. Now they can sometimes make the difference in very important votes for the General Assembly votes. So I think the good thing about multipolarity is that it's giving more power and voices to voices that used to be more unheard, but the side effects for me are actually from the strategic competition, because it encourages proxy wars, it encourages rivalries, powers extending or projecting their fights to other areas in the Global South. So I think that, again, talking about Africa, but it's also the case when we talk about the Yemeni conflict, it actually instrumentalizes local conflicts for the interests of other bigger powers. So for me, the challenge for the Global South would be actually to use their new voices and to actually try to maybe pit the powers against each other. I mean, that would be in their interest, and not just be passive in the matter. I don't know if it answers your question.
And for the second question regarding non-state actors?
Well, just first on the first question, I really am not sure if that we define what Global South means. I mean, we use it all the time, but it's not a bloc as such. I mean, I don't know how many countries we put in it, so I think we must be careful in the way we handle this notion, because, and more generally speaking, beyond the Global South, a multipolar world is by definition unstable and unpredictable, because it's a game of it's a power struggle ongoing always. So you can have a bipolar world, or a multipolar world means poles are trying to compete against each other all the time. So it can be sometimes, for some countries, positive, sometimes negative. I mean, it's not really a good news for anyone such. On the non-state actors, thank you for raising this, because I believe it's a solution perhaps for the crisis of multilateralism. The multilateralism that we saw after the Second World War with the international order relied very much on states, right? Intergovernmental organizations, with the EU perhaps being a bit one of a kind, but otherwise it's mainly states cooperation. And we know how it's. I mean, if you look at the World Health Organization, WTO, many of them have difficulties, or the Security Council of the UN. They're all facing hard challenges, and more we will need non-state actors part of the multilateralism solution. We see it, I think, in the climate change. I mean, the scientific research, the dialogue between scientists and decision makers. When Trump decided that the US would leave the Paris Agreement on climate, well, then we went to see cities, states within the US. So other companies, NGOs decided, well, we're not doing this. So I think more and more cities, states within regions within states, non-NGOs will be part of a new kind of militarism that we will need in this multipolar world.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm afraid we are running out of time. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our amazing panelists and to the organizers.
Thank you. Thank you, the chair, Ramona Bloj, Sébastien Maillard, Djenabou Cissé, and of course Susan Coughtrie. Thank you very, very much.